Well, hello, thank you for watching, and welcome to this series devoted to applying conservative exegesis to biblical texts relevant to the topic of hell. Since hell is an English word and not Hebrew or Greek, and since it may or may not correspond to a variety of different Hebrew and Greek words, and especially since theology is not done best at a mere word level, this study will focus on answering a broader question. Instead of just asking, which verses have the word hell in them and what do I think they mean, the question should be, what view emerges when one asks the question, what does the whole counsel of Scripture say about what happens to the unrepentant, unredeemed wicked? After all, if you think of it, if one of the main messages of Christianity is that Jesus saves, then we should know what he saves us from.
Well, hello. Thank you for coming back to Every Verse on Hell. I'm going to focus in this episode on arguably one of the most iconic paradigms of judgment in the whole Bible, the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah by fire. So, for context, because I feel like it's an important part of the story, we're actually going to start at Genesis 18, verse 17, which is pretty far back before, but, you can skip forward if you want, or you can just come along with me at 1.5 speed if you need to. We're going to start with where it says, "The Lord said, shall I hide from Abraham what I am about to do? Seeing that Abraham shall surely become a great and mighty nation, and all the nations of the earth shall be blessed in him. For I have chosen him, that he may command his children and his household after him to keep the way of the Lord by doing righteousness and justice, so that the Lord may bring to Abraham what he has promised him. Then the Lord said, because the outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is great, and their sin is very grave, I will go down to see whether they have done altogether according to the outcry that has come to me. And if not, I will know." So the men turned from there and went to Sodom. But Abraham still stood before the Lord. Then Abraham drew near and said, "Will you indeed sweep away the righteous with the wicked? Suppose there are 50 righteous within the city. Will you then sweep away the place and not spare it for the 50 righteous who are in it? Far be it from you to do such a thing, to put the righteous to death with the wicked, so that the righteous fare as the wicked. Far be that from you. Shall not the judge of all the earth do what is just?" And the Lord said, "If I find at Sodom 50 righteous in the city, I will spare the whole place for their sake." Abraham answered and said, "Behold, I have undertaken to speak to the Lord, I who am but dust and ashes. Suppose 5 of the 50 righteous are lacking. Will you destroy the whole city for lack of 5? And he said, "I will not destroy it if I find 45 there." Again he spoke to him and said, "Suppose 40 are found there." He answered, "For the sake of 40, I will not do it." Then he said, "Oh, let the Lord not be angry, and I will speak. Suppose 30 are found there." He answered, "I will not do it if I find 30 there." He said, "Behold, I have undertaken to speak to the Lord. Suppose 20 are found there." He answered, "For the sake of 20, I will not destroy it." Then he said, "Oh, let not the Lord be angry, and I will speak again, but this once. Suppose 10 are found there." He answered, "For the sake of 10, I will not destroy it." And the Lord went his way, when he had finished speaking to Abraham, and Abraham returned to his place. So here in Genesis 19, we begin, "The 2 angels came to Sodom in the evening, and Lot was sitting in the gate of Sodom. When Lot saw them, he rose to meet them and bowed himself with his face to the earth, and said, 'My lords, please turn aside to your servant's house and spend the night and wash your feet. Then you may rise up early and go on your way.' They said, 'No, we will spend the night in the town square.' But he pressed them strongly, so they turned aside to him and entered his house. And he made them a feast and baked unleavened bread, and they ate. But before they lay down, the men of the city, the men of Sodom, both young and old, all the people, to the last man," think about that, to the very last man, "surrounded the house. And they called to Lot, 'Where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us that we may know them.'" So this is an entire town about to engage in a gang rape. Lot went out to the men at the entrance, shut the door after him, so he's outside now. The men are inside, Lot's outside, and said, "I beg you, my brothers, do not act so wickedly. Behold, I have 2 daughters who have not known any man. Let me bring them out to you, and do to them as you please. Only do nothing to these men, for they have come under the shelter of my roof." Woo, boy! Okay. Just as a side note, I know that most of us watching this are adults here, but in case you didn't know, or in case you've been interacting with the Bible before, but no one's ever pointed this out to you, there are lots of times in the Bible where something happens that wasn't done the right way, but the Bible doesn't offer a judgment about it on whether it was right or wrong. So, like, for example, when Joseph is in Potiphar's house and Potiphar's wife is coming on to Joseph and he has to run away naked and he was lied about, is there right after that a long essay in the Bible about, why lying and adultery is wrong? No. There's a lot of assumptions on the part of the author that the reader understands what's right and wrong and when a story turns sour and when it doesn't. No, when Tamar gets raped, it doesn't have an essay afterwards talking about how bad rape is, but the author understands that the reader should know that. So anyway, what do you do with a story like this? It's kind of obvious. Lot, although he is called in the New Testament righteous because he's in pain about the wickedness of his city, the Bible does not say that Lot always behaved the right way and made the right decisions. So you could conclude, oh my goodness, look how dark this has become. The most righteous man in the city is so perplexed about how to respond to this that he even offers his daughters, which is a dark thing. I hope you never thought that the Lord approved of that, or that the Lord approves of raping women but not men. That's totally the wrong thing to conclude from this story. Instead, you should go with your gut and say, oh my goodness, wow, this is a horrible story. Every person to the last man wants to gang rape these men, and the only guy trying to defend them has no idea what to do and even offers up his own daughters. I mean, this is terrible. That's exactly how you should be concluding. You don't go out of your way to defend Lot's actions here. That's silly. Okay, that's silly. The most righteous guy in the city has a moral failing. Duh. This is a dark moment in Genesis. Let's just pick this back up in verse 9. But they said, stand back. And they said, this fellow came to sojourn, and he has become the judge? They're referring to Lot. So Lot's not like, quote, one of them. And they're upset that he, even though he's sort of an outsider among them, is going to tell them what to do. So they continue, now we will deal worse with you than with them. Then they pressed hard against the man, Lot, and drew near to break the door down. But the men, that is, the men inside, that is, the angels, reached out their hands and brought Lot into the house with them and shut the door. And they struck with blindness the men who were at the entrance of the house, both small and great, so that they wore themselves out, groping for the door. Then the men said to Lot, have you anyone else here, sons-in-law, sons, daughters, or anyone you have in the city? Bring them out of the place, for we are about to destroy this place, because the outcry against his people has become great before the Lord, and the Lord has sent us to destroy it. Okay, so they apparently did not find the minimum threshold of righteous people. And it was said in verse 4 that all the people to the last man surrounded the house intending to rape these men. So the minimum threshold was not found, and these angels are about to destroy it. So instead, the angels are going to take Lot and his family out. So Lot went out and said to his sons-in-law, who were to marry his daughters, which makes you wonder, where did he go to find them? Are they also blind, groping outside the door? I mean, it says all the people to the last man surrounded the house. So Lot went out and said to his sons-in-law, presumably on the porch, who were to marry his daughters, up, get out of this place, for the Lord is about to destroy the city. But he seemed to his sons-in-law to be jesting. Okay, so they don't take it seriously. As morning dawned, the angels urged Lot, saying, up, take your wife and your 2 daughters who are here, lest you be swept away in the punishment of the city. But he lingered. So the men seized him and his wife and his 2 daughters by the hand, and the Lord being merciful to him, they brought him out and set him outside the city. This is kind of a funny, no, not funny, but interesting image of a man being saved almost against his will. And as they brought them out, one said, escape for your life. Do not look back or stop anywhere in the valley. Escape to the hills, lest you be swept away. And Lot said to them, "Oh no, my lords, behold, your servant has found favor in your sight, and you have shown me great kindness in saving my life. But I cannot escape to the hills, lest the disaster overtake me and I die. Behold, the city is near enough to flee to, and it is a little one. Let me escape there. Is it not a little one? And my life will be saved." He said to them, "Behold, I grant you this favor also, that I will not overthrow the city of which you have spoken. Escape there quickly, for I can do nothing till you arrive there." Therefore the name of the city was called Zoar. Thank you for hanging with me. I think this is important. And if you want to study deep parts of the scripture, you can't just look at one verse here and there and a word or two. Sometimes it's important to read a whole story. Okay, the sun had risen on the earth when Lot came to Zoar. Then the Lord rained on Sodom and Gomorrah sulfur and fire from the Lord out of heaven. And he overthrew those cities and all the valley, and all the inhabitants of the cities, and what grew on the ground. But Lot's wife behind him looked back, and she became a pillar of salt. And Abraham went early in the morning to the place where he had stood before the Lord, and he looked down toward Sodom and Gomorrah, and toward all the land of the valley. And he looked, and behold, the smoke of the land went up like the smoke of a furnace. So it was that when God destroyed the cities of the valley, God remembered Abraham and sent Lot out of the midst of the overthrow when he overthrew the cities in which Lot had lived. Verse 29 technically doesn't say, because God was so impressed with Lot and all of his decisions and actions. Technically, it says God remembered Abraham. So just for your comfort, because of the bizarreness of him offering his daughters, I just want to give you comfort in that it was almost like a favor to Abraham that God rescued Lot. Think about that. That's interesting. Okay, but that's not really the focus today. We're going to summarize what we read. The inhabitants of Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed by fire and brimstone, which I'm not confident how deadly, but I've been told and did some primary research that when brimstone burns, when sulfur burns, it becomes sulfur dioxide and is a poisonous gas. I'm just trying to imagine here, the sky is raining burning sulfur and fire. The building you're in would probably be crushed and destroyed quickly. You might get burned quickly, and even the air you're breathing, if it's thick smoke and poisonous gas, there's no chance of survival. It's probably a swift death, if I had to guess. Probably not a long and drawn out death, but raining fiery sulfur on you, the buildings are destroyed. Even it's such an intense flame as well that the things that grew out of the ground were destroyed. So just imagine all the bushes, trees, and grass being destroyed. The death may have been painful, but the focus is not on their pain or the fear beforehand. The focus of the punishment was their death and being wiped out. Like I said earlier, we're not told how long it took them to die. I'm imagining it was quick. The imagery of this destruction associated with it is a rising smoke, like a furnace from the valley. And the imagery of rising smoke will come up in later parts of the Bible to call to mind what fiery destruction is. And it's a picture of judgment. So what happened to Sodom and Gomorrah is going to be used by later authors in the Bible, Old Testament and New, to sort of call to mind judgment from God for sin. So actually I have some to show you. That's why I would call this a paradigm of judgment. So let's see. Let's look at Deuteronomy 29 first. Moses is speaking here. One who, when he hears the word of the sworn covenant, blesses himself in his heart, saying, I shall be safe, though I walk in the stubbornness of my heart. This will lead to the sweeping away of moist and dry alike. The Lord will not be willing to forgive him, but rather the anger of the Lord and his jealousy will smoke against that man. And the curses written in this book will settle upon him, and the Lord will blot out his name from under heaven. And the Lord will single him out from all the tribes of Israel for calamity, in accordance with all the curses of the covenant written in this book of the law. It says, in the next generation, your children who rise up after you and the foreigner who comes from a far land will say, when they see the afflictions of that land and the sicknesses with which the Lord has made it sick, the whole land burned out with brimstone and salt, nothing sown and nothing growing. where no plant can sprout, an overthrow like that of Sodom and Gomorrah. So there's the reference. We saw smoke, we saw burning, we saw brimstone, and even salt. That's interesting. And it shows, it's a picture of destruction, but it's not just regular destruction. It's a complete overthrow. They've been wiped out completely, like without even plants or sprouts. So this is a warning from the covenant, and we find that in Deuteronomy. So there's Moses calling to mind what happened to Sodom and Gomorrah. So Sodom and Gomorrah is definitely a paradigm for judgment. We see it again in Jeremiah 49. Edom shall become a horror. Everyone who passes by it will be horrified and will hiss because of all its disasters. Well, what are they hissing at? What's the horror? Verse 18. As when Sodom and Gomorrah and their neighboring cities were overthrown, says the Lord, no man shall dwell there, no man shall sojourn in her. In other words, it's just complete desolation, deserted. It's like, it's quiet, it's empty, there's nothing there. It's a ruin. It's not a direct reference to Sodom and Gomorrah, but we see in Isaiah chapter 34, starting in verse 8, for the Lord has a day of vengeance, a year of recompense for the cause of Zion, and the streams of Edom shall be turned to pitch, and her soil into sulfur. Her land shall become burning pitch, night and day it shall not be quenched. Its smoke shall go up forever. So this is part of a threat against the kingdom of Edom, that God is going to completely destroy that kingdom. Of course, it's also not a person. This is a kingdom, so it's not just an individual. But what we're talking about here is the complete destruction of that kingdom and the imagery of smoke going up forever. And let's see here, pitch and sulfur calls to mind the complete destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. In Zephaniah chapter 2, we see, therefore as I live, declares the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, Moab shall become like Sodom, and the Ammonites like Gomorrah, a land possessed by nettles and salt pits, and a waste forever. The remnant of my people shall plunder them, and the survivors of my nation shall possess them. So we see that Sodom and Gomorrah serve as a paradigm of permanent destruction, like being completely wiped out, no chance of survival, no possibility of growing back, but completely being wiped out. Moses in Deuteronomy 29 threatens that against Israelites if they disobey the covenant. Jeremiah threatens this against Edom, and Zephaniah against Moab, and Isaiah as well. So now we'll turn to the New Testament. Again, I'm not going to exhaustively show you any time there's fire and smoke, but I'm going to go to a few references to Sodom and Gomorrah. So we're going to look at Jude 7. In Jude 7, he writes, just as Sodom and Gomorrah and the surrounding cities, which likewise indulged in sexual immorality and pursued unnatural desire, serve as an example by undergoing a punishment of eternal fire. So I'm just going to make a side note here. I hope you don't feel like I'm wasting your time. You could make an argument that Sodom and Gomorrah serve, this is present tense, serve as an example by undergoing a punishment of eternal fire. Because this verb is present tense, I don't believe this argument, but because this verb is present tense, that in some way, Sodom and Gomorrah are still on fire. I believe, I can't say who because I don't have the reference, but I think a few commentators in the distant past had a theory that Sodom and Gomorrah's fires were still burning, or that there was still smoke, because they're currently serving as an example. And present tense, they got to be serving as an example of punishment of eternal fire somehow. So maybe the cities got embers still, or the smoke continues. So I don't think that kind of conclusion is necessary, and I'm going to show you why. It's almost certainly not true that Sodom and Gomorrah are still on fire to this day. Eternal fire could mean a whole host of things. So it could be that eternal fire is a fire that always burns. That's an acceptable understanding. It could mean that eternal fire is a fire that destroys utterly and completely. I would say there's all the Old Testament references I just made outside of Genesis 19 do support that. It could be that this has some eschatological character. It's eternal fire because of its eschatological nature. Or that it comes from the eternal God who burns as a consuming fire. And since God is eternal and this consuming fire is part of his nature, that when God rains his fire, the fire itself is an eternal fire. So all of these could be the way to understand what Jude 7's threat is of eschatological judgment. But if I had to place a guess, since Jude 7 is referring to Genesis 19, and the context of Genesis 19 is fire that destroys completely, then Jude 7's threat is most likely a fire that does the same kind of thing that we saw in Genesis 19. You could also say there's eschatological character that could be in view. And of course, fire that comes from God would also be seen as eternal. So I would say all of these meanings are very good candidates for what Jude is saying. Now, but as far as the inhabitants of Sodom and Gomorrah serving currently as an example, because the verb is present tense, is concerned, let's look at other uses of that word, serve as an example, and then see what we can learn. So we see this verb, this may not be a good example, but in 2 Corinthians 8, for if the readiness is there, so that there it is, there is the same verb, it's acceptable according to what a person has. That may not be a good example, but it just shows that, the readiness is there currently. So, are the inhabitants of Sodom and Gomorrah currently here serving as examples? I would say, my gut instinct says no, and I have a good reason for that. I'll show you later. But here's just that same verb. Here's another example of that same verb, Hebrews 6. So that by two unchangeable things in which it is impossible for God to lie, we who have fled for refuge might have strong encouragement to hold fast to the hope set before us. That's that same verb, set before us. It is there. Hebrews 12, we see it twice in verse 1 and in verse 2. Those are also, set before us, set before us. So the inhabitants of Sodom and Gomorrah, according to Jude 7, they serve currently as an example. In other words, they're set before us as those who would be an example of what it means to undergo a punishment of eternal fire. So what does it mean that they're currently set before us? Using the verb, current, present tense. Language is pretty elastic, and in my opinion, this is akin to saying Shakespeare writes. Like if I was talking about Hamlet, and I say, here in this act, Shakespeare writes the following. Well, just because I use present tense doesn't mean Shakespeare is, one, currently alive, or two, that Hamlet is not a complete work because Shakespeare is still writing it. You know what I mean by it. I'm holding Hamlet before you as an example, and Shakespeare, writes the following just means look what he wrote. It's right in front of us. Now, do I have any evidence that this verb in Greek can be used that way? Yes, actually. In Josephus's The Jewish War, I think it's book 6. The book I have, the Penguin Classics version, I'm on page 345 and it's in chapter 20. Josephus writes, "And do you think you can count on God whom you've denied, his everlasting worship, to be your ally in the war? And do you blame your own sins on the Romans who have throughout respected our law and are now pressing you to restore to God the sacrifices which you have interrupted? But consider, John, to turn back on evil ways is no disgrace, even at the last moment. If you wish to save your birthplace, you have a splendid example before you." This is the same verb, and it's also in present tense. Look what he's showing us. "In Jehoiakim, king of the Jews, when the king of Babylon made war on him through his own fault, he left the city of his own accord before its capture." Now, the reason why that's interesting is because when Josephus is writing, Jehoiakim's long been dead, and nobody, as far as I can tell, has any theory that Jehoiakim's still alive interacting with the king of Babylon. It's a past event being held before the readers as an example currently. Jehoiakim's behavior is currently an example before us, even though Jehoiakim's dead. So Jude 7, he's saying that Sodom and Gomorrah and the surrounding cities and their inhabitants, they serve as an example of what undergoing a punishment of eternal fire is. That doesn't have to mean that we need to create an odd theory that Sodom and Gomorrah are still burning. Like if you go looking archaeologically, you're going to find embers still burning, or that the smoke is still going up. You don't have to stretch the scriptures to mean something like that. It could just be that, like English, Greek has an elasticity where you can use present tense to portray an example even if the event is far past. Okay, so I think you can comfortably conclude that Jude is referring to Sodom and Gomorrah the same way Moses, Jeremiah, and Zephaniah and Isaiah do, by recounting the tale of their fiery death as a paradigm for judgment to come. Okay, so on to 2 Peter's treatment of Genesis 19. We see in 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 6, Peter writes, "If by turning the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah to ashes, he condemned them to extinction, making them an example of what is going to happen to the ungodly." I'm just going to stop there. You know, almost any commentary you pick up on 2 Peter or on Jude is going to say that Jude and 2 Peter are very close parallels thematically and even structurally. So it makes sense that you would read both of these sort of in parallel to another. I just read ESV. I'm not sure what other translations say at the moment, but the ESV translates, he condemned them, catastrophe, as extinction, which is a word that is also used in 2 Timothy 2, and I think it's just these two places. So 2 Peter 2, 6, we see catastrophe, and 2 Timothy 2, 14. It seems like Paul's using this hyperbolically, like remind them of these things and charge them before God not to quarrel about words, which does no good, but only ruins the hearers. So he's like, the hearers are going to be destroyed by it. It seems like a metaphor or hyperbole. You can also see this word used in 1 Clement, chapter 57, verse 4. "Since I called and ye did not hearken," I'm sorry about the Old English, "and prolonged my words, and ye attended not, but made my counsels of none effect, and were not obedient to my reproofs, therefore I will laugh at your destruction. I will exult when desolation comes upon you, and when perturbation hath suddenly come upon you, and ruin is at hand like a whirlwind." That word ruin is the same, catastrophe. Look in the Septuagint, Proverbs 1's ruin like a whirlwind, parallel there. "When tribulation and oppression come upon you." I was going to start with the Proverbs 1, but since they're close parallels, and since Proverbs doesn't clarify what the ruin means, but 1 Clement does, I thought for the linguistic argument, I should just go with 1 Clement. Okay, so verse 5, "For the time shall come when ye shall call upon me, and I shall not hearken unto you. The wicked shall seek me and not find me. They hated wisdom and chose not the fear of the Lord. They were not willing to attend to my counsels. They mocked at my rebukes. Wherefore they shall eat the fruits of their own way. They shall be filled with their own unrighteousness. For because they wronged the innocent, they shall be slain." So clearly the word catastrophe can mean, ruin in a metaphorical sense, although I think even there, Paul's using hyperbole. The word may mean destruction, as it does here in 1 Clement 57, verse 7, they are going to be slain. So that is the end of those who will suffer catastrophe, which is clearly the context of Genesis 19 anyway. So it seems like that is the threat that Peter offers in 2 Peter chapter 2, which really, when you think about it, is entirely consistent with how the Old Testament uses the paradigm of judgment in Genesis 19. Moses does this, Jeremiah, Isaiah, Zephaniah. They refer to Sodom and Gomorrah as an example of fiery destruction because it is a paradigm of God's judgment against sin. So, how does Peter mean to use it? He reminds his readers that their cities were turned to ashes. They were exterminated. And we know from reading Genesis 19 that is exactly what happened to the inhabitants. So Peter is likely using the word the same way 1 Clement does, to signify that the unrepentant wicked will be condemned to destruction in the way that those at Sodom and Gomorrah were. Next video, we're going to do principles of judgment found in Proverbs and the Psalms. And then I think the video after that, we're going to look through the prophets. We will eventually get to the New Testament. Thank you for your patience. Thank you for watching this video. I know I did a lot of reading, but to be honest with you, it's the kind of reading that if you were interested in this topic, you should be doing as well. So I hope you found that to be good, a good resource to you. To be honest with you, you do not learn things from the Bible by just reading a verse or two or three here and there. The narrative itself, I think, is one of the most powerful ways that God communicates not only what He's like, but His deeds and what He will do in the future. And so we saw a very clear paradigm of judgment here in Genesis 19, and it echoes throughout the rest of Scriptures. as a threat of punishment against sin. So anyway, thank you for watching.